A Duvid here. We are live for another week of tour of my bookshelf. So thank God for been
Another
going
week
here
of tour.
for about 8 weeks. So I was going to do a few other things till I got to my Jewish books, and I was trying to organize my books because I have kind of everything in a mess. And then I figured, okay, it was the easiest for me to just jump in and do Jewish biographies. So hopefully you'll see the books behind me in the section. Those four books are all Judaica, and then I have more around that. It will be easy for me to organize my Jewish books. So I figure I would start. It'd be a good way, introduction wise, thematically, and practically, to start with biographies. So I have quite a bit, probably like 2 shelves of Jewish biographies, and how exactly to understand Jewish biographies is also
Jewish biography.
a little bit tough. So Luke Ford, if he's around, he could hop on and join my stream if he wants. But um, so if you pop in the chat, I talked with Luke on his stream about the nature of Jewish studies, and from an academic level of history and secular studies versus kind of legends of rabbis. So from an Orthodox perspective, how do we understand the sages and the rabbis? How do we write about them? And to say, like, generally, historically, we didn't. That you didn't really have biographies. You had stories, you had lessons of the rabbis, but you didn't really have biographies like they were born here on this date and then did this and this and went to these schools. You might have like their birth date and certain factual elements of things that happened during the lifetimes. But the concept of a modern biography, um, that's a separate matter. And when I get to my history books, we might talk about the theories of history. But suffice it to say, the modern understanding of a biography um, really only comes in the last few hundred years. Obviously, like Benjamin Franklin wrote an autobiography. The concept of an autobiography or a history, a sketch of the life of great men exist in the ancient world in probably Roman and Greek times. I'm not sure if in the ancient Judaic world there was such a thing as a biography, and I'll talk about biographies of some of the ancient sages. So before I jump into the books, I'll give a few more precursors. Like I mentioned, the theory of Pharisaic Orthodox Judaism is based on this concept of the sages of the generation. And you'll say, okay, what does it say in the Torah? What does it say in the Talmud? That's important. But Jewish law, Jewish practice is determined by the sages of the generation. And then there's a question like, well, who are the sages of the generation? How are they recognized? How are they voted upon? And it's actually quite complicated. There's the smicha controversy of the actual ordainment of a rabbi, the establishment of a rabbinic court that dies out in the period of the Talmud. The last time smicha was attempted to be conferred in Roman times, the rabbi was martyred for doing it. And then you have Rav Yosef Karo and the rabbis in Sfas about 500 years ago, who also attempted to revive smicha. You have the Rambam's commentary that in order to revive smicha, hey Jennifer, thanks for tuning in. You basically need all of the sages of the generation to agree, which is impractical. So in Sfas, when they revived smicha, an official rabbinate, there were rabbis in Jerusalem that didn't agree, and it fell apart. There's been attempts in modern Israel to revive like historical smicha. There's elected rabbis in Israel. There's the chief rabbis, and various elements. Oswald, thanks for tuning in. But suffice it to say, even though there's no definitive way to say who the sages of the generation are, we still follow the sages of the generation. So if you're in a Jewish community, like if you're in Israel, you'll be big gatherings and the rabbis show up and they sit, at tables up front, or there's, communal ceremonies, weddings, yeshivas, and there's authors of books. There's what's called, judges, rabbis who write literature about legal rulings. Now, I don't have anything by Rabbi Antelman, and he wouldn't be considered from the sages, like from an Orthodox perspective. So there's also, like I said, the books that I'm showing today are basically all going to be books written by Orthodox Jews for Orthodox Jews. So unless you're an Orthodox Jew, maybe even like I wouldn't be surprised if even like many Reform rabbis haven't heard of 75% of the people in the books that I'll be showing today. Because generally, there's the nature of Judaism also that when you're in the so to say the Orthodox world, Judaism, Jewish books are written exclusively by Orthodox rabbis for Orthodox Jews, and books that are Orthodox rabbis almost never write a book for the general public. In fact, I can't think of one. Maybe going back to like Maimonides in history, but I can't think of a single Orthodox rabbi in the last few hundred years that has written a popular work for the general public. There's your Rabbi Avram Yeshua Heschel that was Orthodox and became conservative and wrote popular books. There's the famous Rabbi Harold Kushner, who wrote the Why Bad Things Happen to Good People books. Conservative rabbi, they're popular authors. There's people like Ben Shapiro that are loosely connected to Orthodoxy, but there's really not such a thing as Orthodox Jews writing for non-Jews. And we might, as I get into it, we might talk about why more that is. So if you're not an Orthodox Jew, almost any book that you've heard of isn't an Orthodox rabbi, unless you went to the point of getting a book that was written for Orthodox Jews, even though you may be a non-Jew. I would say, like, you could order online, you could go to your local Judaica store and buy some books. So it's not like, any of these books you could buy straight off the internet. So even if you're a non-Jew, you could go to your local Judaica bookstore. They'll relatively be happy to sell you the books. But I was mentioning a little complications of it and thinking my own role, because I think like for a decade, I tried to be, to the best of my ability, an Orthodox Hasidic Jew, and what I would call the sages, the great rabbis, preferred me as a non-Jew. They thought I was more valuable to the Jewish people as a half-Jew or as a non-Jew. Say that my Jewish status to the most ultra-Orthodox Jews is questionable in status. Like I said, my mother's lineage, although she's definitely 100%, 99+% Ashkenazic Jew, her actual status, although I get full Israeli citizenship, that according to most Orthodox Jews, Haredim, I would have to go through some sort of conversion process in order to be an Orthodox Jew, and that's because their standards, basically, if you have to have an Orthodox Jew in your immediate history, and I don't have any Orthodox family, and my grandmother's father was Orthodox, tried to be Orthodox, even though he married a secular Jewish woman and raised his kids Reform. And, so the complication questions of Jewish identity. And then, okay, so Duvid studied in Orthodox synagogues. Duvid served, got advice from some of the sages. I have met some of the rabbis in the books that I'll be showing here today. And for whatever reasons, we'll say that I was more valuable to the sages as a non-Jew than a Jew, which is a little bit complicated, and you get very complicated things with who defines Judaism. So as I said, the books that I'll be showing today are almost exclusively about Orthodox rabbis, and these books are specifically written for Orthodox Jews. And even the question of a sage, the whole concept of a sage, the sages of the generation, Jewish law, is almost completely within the realm of Orthodox Jews, or Haredim, or however you say. Orthodox is kind of a misnomer. And I'll talk about Lubavitch also. And in the future, maybe I'll do I have like 5 books, biographies of the Lubavitch Rebbe, that I'm going to be going over today. So maybe at a different time, I'll do a stream on my Lubavitch books. But today I'll show I have 5 different books just on the biography of the Lubavitch Rebbe. And so the Lubavitch Rebbe, in many aspects, shouldn't be included among the pantheon of Haredi sages, and many of the organizations that bring together Haredi and Orthodox people do not include the Lubavitch Rebbe. And so these are very complicated things. But just say that we follow, I call myself a Stam Chassid. I follow all the Rebbes, all the sages. I'm not a follower of a specific Rebbe. And so you'll have different organizations of rabbis and Rebbes that include certain rabbis, like Agudas Yisrael used to be ran by the Novominsker Rebbe. And since the Novominsker Rebbe, of blessed memory, who I got blessings from a few times, went to the mikveh there many times in Borough Park, passed away, the Agudas Yisrael has switched more towards generic orthodoxy. And we'll talk about United Torah Judaism and Shas that have rabbinic councils of accepted sages that make up political parties in Israel. And there's been some questions of gatherings, who should be included. And the Satmar Rebbe was invited, and the Satmar Rebbe actually is a direct descendant from the Alter Rebbe of Chabad, and said he didn't want to show up if Chabad wasn't there. But generally, Agudas Yisrael and many of the rabbinic organizations don't recognize Chabad rabbis in terms of their gathering of sages. And I don't want to get too much into taking the sectarians. I will show my books, and maybe after the end we could do an AMA. So Abe Bakora, thanks for showing up. You didn't reach out about talking about Freemasonry. The chief rabbi in Israel is an elected position. And so, like I said, and the chief Israel rabbinic is divided between Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews, because generally Ashkenazic Jews only follow the rulings of Ashkenazic rabbis, and Sephardic rabbis only follow the ruling of Sephardic rabbis. So Yitzchak Yosef, if you call him the sage of the generation, from the sages of the generations, from the Haredim, a senior advisor for the Shas party. So Netanyahu's unity, government will include Shas and United Torah Judaism that are both under the auspices of the sages, and the chief Sephardi rabbis are recognized as sages, but generally the Ashkenazic rabbis are considered superior sages to the Sephardic rabbis in terms of scholarship. We'll discuss a little bit about that history. I had the Artscroll biography of Ovadia Yosef, and I actually gave that to Dishan. But historically, there were periods of time where the greatest sages were Sephardi, and then there were period of time where the greatest sages are Ashkenazic. Until today, there's a rise. Maybe you have the Yenuka, but the yeshiva tradition, the greatest sages of the generation, are almost all Ashkenazic, the Rebbes. And in America, you have Sephardic Jews, you have Sephardic chief rabbis. There's really not that many Sephardic yeshivas. So in the U.S., like I said, okay, we're European Jews. Sephardi means Spanish, but generally now if you see Sephardi is the umbrella term that includes all non-Ashkenazic Jews, which will include Eastern Arabic Jews. So you have Syrian Jews in Brooklyn. You have Iraqi Jews, Moroccan Jews, and they have their sages and their rabbis, but in terms of learning scholarship, they're generally not considered on the same level as the Ashkenazic rabbis. However, if you're a Sephardic Jew, generally, even the Ashkenazic rabbis will encourage you to go to your Sephardic rabbi. So, from a sages of the generation perspective, you go to your local rabbi, the rabbi on your corner. So I'm here in Detroit. I should follow the rabbis of Detroit. Not necessarily rabbis in various lands, like they say, consult with your local Orthodox rabbi. Secular Jews still have a rabbinic class. There's still some authority of the rabbis. There's still a conversion process. Like basically all Jews, even Reconstructionist Jews, have a conversion process that's overseen by rabbis. A lot of them have board of directors. So even modern Orthodox synagogues and organizations are generally ran by board of directors, and they don't feel under the direct authority of the sages. So it's pretty complicated. I might talk a little bit more about it than Oswald. The Ashkenazim have a different term than European. The center of European Jewry, including Russian Jewry, was in Germany for a period. Almost all of them spoke Yiddish. Russian Jews are considered Ashkenazic unless they moved to Russia from Eastern lands, like the Arab Jews, and so and most Jews lived in Eastern Europe. So Ashkenazic Jews, although Ashkenazic literally means German, so Ashkenazic Jews just means German Jews. Almost all European Jews come from Eastern Europe, and although there were, I've talked about this history before many times. Like even up into World War II, there were only about 500,000 Jews in Western Europe. Almost all of the 10 million Jews that lived in Europe coming into World War II lived in Eastern Europe and migrated to the U.S. and Israel, and the border between Poland, Galicia, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and Russia keep on changing borders. I'll show a book on it. But they're all the same genetic stock, that all European Jews basically have the same DNA. Henry Abramson was showing the most recent study. But no matter where a person comes from in Europe, generally they're descended from at most a few hundred families. So the genetic proximity between all Ashkenazic Jews, no matter where in the continent, is very similar. And even Sephardic Jews, there's that actually come from Spain. The divergence between Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews, happens 800 to 600 years ago, as opposed to the Eastern Jews. There's significantly different DNA differences. But within Ashkenazic Jews, the sages are different depending on where you come from. That generally you had Hungarian, Russian, Lithuanian, Galiciana, German, English, and the Jews followed the sages of their area. So even though genetically, basically all Ashkenazic Jews are very close and come from a single cluster, that they lived in different areas. And when they came to Israel, after the war, God forbid, and most Orthodox Jews ended up in Israel or Brooklyn or a handful of places, that there was intermarriage between the different Jews. So the Jews were all over Eastern Europe into World War II, and then put into smaller areas like Metro New York or Israel, and largely now intermarry with each other. So the genetic proximity of the recognition of the sages between all European Jews are, so if you're Russian and secular and don't recognize the sages, is different nature. So let me jump right in with some of these books. So I'm going to do this by publisher, because I have a whole bunch of Artscroll books. So people who know Jewish books, there's only a handful of main publishers of books. So the biggest publisher, obviously, is Artscroll. Artscroll that translates, the Talmud, the prayer book. If you go into a synagogue, you'll see Artscroll all over with, the translation and commentary on the Talmud and the prayer book and various things. But Feldheim is probably the second biggest publisher. And, Jennifer's mentioned that Gershon Schoen is not considered a sage because he didn't maintain his practice. Like, he was considered a scholar, but not a sage. So being a sage is multiple fold. It's to being completely subservient to the tradition, to following the tradition, to praying 3 times a day, following the law, to the unbroken transmission that you can't become a sage independently on your own. Sageship is conferred by studying under sages of the previous generation, and generally the sages are part of institutes, Hasidics, yeshivas, large synagogues. And Gershon Schoen was not an Orthodox Jew. He did not keep the practices, and although was a scholar, he was a professor at I think Hebrew University, or one of the major universities in Israel. So, as I'm going to be almost exclusively, I'll show a handful of other books, but I'm going to be almost exclusively talking about Orthodox rabbis today, and say my background in Judaism came from Orthodoxy. I went to Israel and started Or Samek, and then I was in Mir Yeshiva. I studied in Hasidic yeshivas, Karlin Stolen under the Tol Samar Yitzchak Rebbe, under Reb Daniel Frisch of blessed memory, and then in Brooklyn under Moshe Wolfson of Emunah Yisrael, the Sklen Rebbe of blessed memory, Bubov. So the first 10 years of my adult Jewish experience was completely under the auspices and authority of mainstream Orthodox rabbis. When I came back to Detroit, I worked with Chabad, and I would say even when I was in Israel, in Brooklyn, I worked with Chabad in my later years, but like in Borough Park, the Chabad rabbis are not included among the sages. They might do good work, they might be respected, but they have they're like modern Orthodoxy. They have slight deviations from what would be mainstream Orthodoxy, and so now we could talk about like what is Judaism, Big Tent Judaism. I'll talk about the Rebbe in soon. We'll get to that. So let me jump right in with some books. So as I said, these are all biographies. So in a future tour of my library, I'll talk more about the Torah, the teachings. I'll mention this last thing with Moshe Wolfson. When I studied in his Tanya class, and I listened to his tapes on Tanya, and I went to the first few classes in Emunah Yisrael that Rabbi Wolfson had a regular ongoing Tanya class, and you could still get online the tapes of Rabbi Moshe Wolfson in the start of his Tanya class. I'm not sure how far back the story was, where this maskil, this secular Jew, enlightened Jew, asked the rabbi like a question: what are the name of Rashi's 4 daughters? And the rabbi, Rabbi Wolfson had some statement like, I don't know, what kind of snuff container Rashi used. I know what he wrote. I know what he taught. And saying that the main thing is the Torah that they taught, their ideas, their commentary, their rulings, not their biography. So like within Orthodoxy, very little emphasis is placed on biography. Sometimes you have what's called Maisim Tzadikim, stories of the righteous, and there's a belief that the sages are miracle workers. So all of these books are in the style of legends of rabbis, and the assumptions from the religious perspective, is that these are men who are men of God, that are inspired by God, have some special insight into the will of God, the Ratzon Hashem, and have levels of divine providence that could work miracles in various ways. So just two quick stories: the famous Baal Shem Tov story, where it said, telling stories of Tzaddikim, Motzi Shabbos is a segula for Parnasa, which you're saying telling stories of the sages, telling stories of the Baal Shem Tov on after Sabbath is a special merit for giving person livelihood and money. So the rabbi corrected the person who was saying telling stories of any Jewish sage, not just the Baal Shem Tov, not just Motzi Shabbos after Shabbos, but any time, and gives benefit for all things in life. And so the concept of telling stories of the sages is extremely important to Judaism, especially Hasidus, but even all forms of Orthodox Judaism, where we tell legends of rabbis, and we believe that rabbis have some miraculous power. Either that they pray for people and they get better, or that they listen to what the rabbi said and it miraculously provided them benefit. And the other story of the Chafetz Chaim, Rav Yisrael Meir Chagin, who wrote the books on Lashon Hora, proper speech, once had to testify in front of court, and the judge, I think this would have been in Israel, said, I've heard all these stories of miracles that you've done. Are these true? And the rabbi, I forget his exact words, he said, well, not necessarily, but with all due respect, they don't tell these stories about you. That saying that whether the rabbis are miracle people or not, that stories, miracle stories, are said about Haredi rabbis. They're not really said about anybody else. No one says miracle stories about generic Israeli politicians, leaders, reform rabbis, conservative rabbis. And then there's other statement about the Talmud that if you believe all the stories, you're crazy. If you believe none of them, you're also crazy. I forget the exact wording, but means say you don't have to believe every miracle story said about the rabbis is true, but you should believe that they could happen. That that if you pray regularly, that you go to rabbis, you take their advice, that miraculously things will benefit you, and you improve your life, and that God is behind that. If you ask a rabbi what to do and then accept their ruling, that the power of God is behind their ruling. So that's the nature of these Orthodox books about so to say the accepted sages. They're more like legends, and there's an assumption that Haredi Judaism is true. It's true that these men are men of God, leaders of the generation, and that the people who follow their dictates get the benefit from God. That if you want to come on to God, that you could come on to these words. So we're just mentioning that's the nature of all of these books. So Abramson is kind of in between, like Henry Abramson's History, some of the rabbis, where he'll try to give, leave it in the Orthodox camp, but he's also kind of like modern Orthodox or historian, and it's hard to find a middle ground. So there's also a question like the history, how do these rabbis become sages? So within Orthodox Judaism, the accepted path, there was a famous Artscroll book called like The Making of a Gadol that was written by, a big rabbi's like niece or something like that. And it said, and then it got censored, but the concept, how do you become great? So according to Judaism, you come great from listening to the rabbis, from studying Torah, from praying, from following the law, from the basic principles that Orthodox Judaism teaches. So these books that give the history of it endorse the lifestyle. So all of these rabbis, in general, followed the rules, did what they were supposed to do, became great, and then led the generation. And we'll see when we get to the Lubavitch rabbi, Rebbe, the Lubavitch Rebbe didn't follow the straight and narrow path. The Lubavitch Rebbe went to university and was more involved with the secular world in various things that will be slightly different than the majority story of the rabbis. So like a lot of precursors there. So let me jump right in. So just to get the feel in the relation to Israeli politics, here is Rabbi Shlomo Lorentz. He might have passed away already. I'm not sure of blessed memory or not. These are translated from Hebrew. Shlomo Lorentz was a member of Knesset for United Torah Judaism. And he was an Orthodox Jew. Some people called him a rabbi. You could call Rabbi Shlomo Lorentz a rabbi, but he was not a sage. He was just a rabbi. And so like he was a rabbi, like like your local Orthodox rabbi, but he wasn't a sage. But because he was one of the rabbis for Agudas Yisrael, he met with the rabbis and sages and was in deference to what they said. Meaning to say that if you're a proper Orthodox Jew, you ask your rabbi and you do what your rabbi says. You don't get to argue with your rabbi. You don't, to a certain extent, you don't get to think for yourself. I mean, you could think for yourself, but when it comes for important rulings, you do what the rabbis say, no questions. Or, I mean, you might ask questions. I mean, you could ask the rabbis questions or look into it or try to understand their reasoning. But at the end of the day, and like Rabbi Zwiebel, I saw him on Meaningful People, and he was actually telling the story of his son, Rabbi Sender. I was in yeshiva in Mir Yeshiva in Israel with Sender Zwiebel. I was at his wedding. He married a Yerushalmi woman, Rabbi Zwiebel's son, Sender, and he was a lawyer. He was the head of Agudas Yisrael, and he was mentioning that a lot of the people in Agudas Yisrael, the business leaders, know a lot more about certain things than the sages, but they voluntarily submit themselves to the rulings of the sages. So in modern Orthodoxy, you don't really find that. There's no voluntary submitting to the sages. So that's, the fine dividing line of the Haredi Orthodox, where you submit yourself at the end of the day to what the sages say. Modern Orthodoxy, at the end of the day, will not necessarily submit to what the sages say. Orthodoxy is led by the sages. Modern Orthodoxy, unless, could be led by business leaders, powerful Jews that are not sages. So Agudas Yisrael, Feldheim, Shlomo Lorentz, these are good series. I recommend these books for anyone who wants a feel on, especially Israeli Gedolim. 3 volumes in their shadow. Volume 1, the Chazanish, the Brisker Rav, and Reb Shach. They're from like the first generation of major rabbis in Israel, and talking about some of the big issues that affected Haredi Jews in Israel in terms of politics with the state, the draft laws, women in service, Zionism, all sorts of battles. And he consulted regularly with all of these rabbis, the Chazanish, Brisker Rav, Reb Shach. Volume 2 has the Panovitcher Rav, Rav Eliyahu Lopin, Vizhnitzer Rebbe, Satmar Rebbe, Ger Rebbe, Rav Moshe Feinstein, a whole bunch. In Volume 3, a whole bunch of major rabbis in Israel. So these were very, good books in their shadow. Volume 1, 2, and 3, Feldheim, Rav Shlomo Lorentz, who was a member of Knesset for United Torah Judaism and met regularly with, so to say, the sages, the biggest rabbis in Israel, to discuss what he should do in terms of voting and Israeli politics. Here's a Feldheim book, Nor nor by the moon by night. And God forbid, this is mostly about World War II, Bobov, the survival of the Hasidic dynasty of Bobov, and this talking about what happened in Bobov during World War II. And God forbid, so it's not a complete biography. I think it has, a little bit of a history of Bobov, and Bobov's, place where I studied and, even served, the rabbis. I was there under Rav Shlomi Halberstam, who, God forbid, saw his father killed right in front of him. And his first wife, died, and his son, Rav Naftolchik, who was born in Europe. And the town of Bobov was basically destroyed, and they had to flee and rebuild up. So this mostly focuses just on World War II. This is an interesting book, Rav Shela. So this rabbi is really popular right now and is a believed miracle worker. So if you're in like Williamsburg, you'll see the pictures of this rabbi all over the place. Some people on their bumper stickers or like medallions. And this rabbi was believed to be a miracle worker of Koretztir, and it's one of the most popular pilgrimage sites in Europe, where many on the yurt site or all year go to Koretztir to pray at the grave of Rav Shaila. And so he was a Hasidic Rebbe who is most widely known and famous as a miracle worker. And I think I forget what year he passed away. I think he passed away even. I think his years, he was in the 1800s. I'm not quite sure the years. But so a famous Hasidic Rebbe that is still very popular today among Hasidic Jews. Not well known outside of Hasidic Judaism. Within Hasidic Judaism, Reb Shela, one of the most famous Rebbes till today. Here's another Holocaust book, A Sun and a Shield, Through the Forest of Transylvania, the Peneth Family of Dej. So Dej is a Hasidic group. Most of these are towns like Koretztir, Bobov, Dej are all towns in Eastern Europe. So, I knew some of the Penet family. Learned in Bobov. There's Dej, there's a few different Dej synagogues in Borough Park. I'd driven or worked together with some of, I prayed in the Dej synagogue. There's Dej in Miami and in Israel. World War II, God forbid, this is a pretty intense book. I think they stayed in open fields. They survived the war, at the charity of Polish peasants and sleeping in an open field. God forbid, compelling story. The Dej Hasidus, a well-known Hasidus, not that big of a Hasidus, but Borough Park, Miami, Israel, they have synagogues. I said these books are all Feldheim, so I'm doing this by publisher. The Life and Times of Reb Referral Soloveitchik of Brisk. So Reb Referral Soloveitchik is it has the family tree. So there's a big Soloveitchik family. Generally, I'll talk about the Rav of Yeshiva University. But the town of Brisk was a major center of Torah learning, and in Europe before the war, and then after the war, the Brisk, the Soloveitchik rabbinic dynasty, if you want to use that word, set up Brisk yeshivas in Israel and in America, and the Rav J.B. Soloveitchik, who became kind of Zionist and modern Orthodox, became the Rav of Yeshiva University, as opposed to the main Brisk yeshivas in Jerusalem are pretty anti-Zionist. They don't take money from the state of Israel. And so Raful, I believe, ended up in Israel, and he was a major rabbi in the town of Brisk, and so within the Haredi world, outside of the Haredi world, like the only Rabbi Soloveitchik people have heard of, Mayor Soloveitchik was like a Republican. He did a Hanukkah lighting with Trump, and J.B. Soloveitchik ordained like 3,000 Orthodox rabbis through Yeshiva University, even here in Metro Detroit. There's rabbis that are ordained by J.B. Soloveitchik, but in the Orthodox world, J.B. Soloveitchik, is considered off the derrick. And from the biggest sages in the Torah world are the Soloveitchiks, that like all they do is eat and sleep Torah. They learn Torah like 18 hours a day. They hardly sleep. All they do is study Torah. And in Jerusalem, there's many brisk yeshivas. It's considered in generally the best yeshiva in the world. You have Mir Yeshiva, which is the biggest. The level of learning at Brisk is considered like a notch higher. And they're headed under the Soloveitchik family, and it's what they call like a mahalik, a way in learning. So here is not a well known of the Soloveitchiks, but very important in the history of yeshiva and Torah learning. Here's another book, God forbid, Holocaust book, Trials and Triumph by Rav Dov Eliachik, the miraculous stories of 8 young men who survived the war and reset up in Jerusalem. And they're all kind of mainstream rabbis, respectable rabbis, some even Rosh Hashivas, but not necessarily like major sages. But there was an interesting book. I bought a lot of these books, discount price off of a son of a local rabbi who was like dumping off his books. He needed some money, so he sold me some of his English books. The Kloisenberg Rebbe, The War Years. So, called one of the sages, Kloisenberg, Sans Kloisenberg, Kloisenberg's, the Halberstam family, the Sanzer Rebbe, the first Sanzer Rebbe, major Rebbe, and he has like 4 sons, and they go to different towns. So Bubba's are Halberstams, Kloisenberg's Halberstams, Sans Halberstams, and there's a lot of different branches and Hasidics that are descended from. Kloisenberg is one of the larger Hasidic groups. So in Israel, they have a whole town of Kloisenberg, and Kloisenberg is a town in Europe, God forbid, destroyed World War II. And thousands of Hasidim. And, Borough Park, there's a Kloisenberg Yeshiva. I used to go to the Kloisenberg Tish, the Kloisenberg Rebbe. And in Israel, there's a few different Kloisenberg Hasidices, and they even have like their own town and hospital. But the Kloisenberg Rebbe survived the war, survived the death camps, God forbid, was in the Warsaw Ghetto, Auschwitz, and Dachau, and then ended up in New York and was integral in reestablishing Hasidic Judaism after the war. So, one of the major sages of your previous generation, the Kloisenberg Rebbe. So this is translated from Hebrew. Here, Reb Breuer, his life and legacy. So Reb Breuer is borderline modern Orthodox. Reb Breuer, I think, was the son-in-law of Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. So like German Jewry, and I think set up a synagogue in New York, translated some of Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch's works, and bears kind of the tradition of German Jewry. So he studied under Reb Hirsch in Frankfurt, and then came to America and helped set up German modern, which is closer to modern Orthodoxy, German Jewry. But Reb Breuer, I believe he was the son-in-law of Reb Samson Raphael Hirsch, or major student, and was considered the forebearer of the Hirschian tradition, and I think set up in like the Bronx, or and be one of the forebearers of maybe yeshiva university type Judaism. And here Feldheim, Rav Mohan, Rav Avram Cutler, probably one of the top three most important figures in American Jewry, with Rav Moshe Feinstein, Rav Aaron Cutler, are probably the two biggest names in American Jewry. And Rav Aaron Cutler is the founder of Lakewood. So he came during the war. He became the head of the, I forget the name, but the refugee committee that tried to help European Jews during the Holocaust. He negotiated with like Italian mafia, non-Jewish leaders, and set up Lakewood, which is now the biggest yeshiva in America, that is largely ran by his descendants, and also a blue-eyed man. But Aaron Cutler, one of so probably him and Rav Moshe, probably the single most important names in American Orthodox Jewry. And the biggest effect today is setting up Lakewood Yeshiva in New Jersey, which today is the largest yeshiva in America. And this has a biography and his teachings in the history in Europe to God forbid, during the war. He was already one of the major rabbis. From the level of this, I would talk about later of Eliezer Silver, who from the level of this book, basically Rabbi Silver just hands his operation over to Rav Cutler when he gets here to America. That Rav Cutler is considered in many ways like the first major Orthodox rabbi in America. Comes over during the war, was from the major sages in Europe, and the first thing he does is help establish Orthodoxy here in America, and also do everything possible to salvage whatever could be saved from the destruction of European Jewry. So I said, Aaron Cutler, probably the two biggest names in American Orthodox Jewry of Aaron Cutler and Rav Moshe, who we'll get to soon. So put these on my shelf. Okay, so next I'm going to do my Artscroll, and I have the most of the Artscroll. I thought I had more of these, so I'll start with one of the founders of Artscroll, who I believe I met. I didn't meet him. I'm saying he was a rabbi, shook his hand, got a blessing from him. I feel like Orthodox, you don't meet. I didn't meet Reb Meir Zlotowitz. Like I shook his hand, and maybe he gave me a blessing or something like that. But Reb Meir Zlotowitz is one of the founders of Artscroll, and passed away recently. And so they wrote a biography of him in the Artscroll edition. Yisroel Besser, who's written a lot of books. He might have been interviewed on Meaningful People. I think I watched that. Oswald, it really doesn't work like that. Like in terms of book recommendations, it's hard to recommend one book. Saying like Jews were the people of the book. So like you want to be knowledgeable, you're not going to read one book. You might start with one book, but like, no, I mean, you got to constantly be studying. And, like if you start with one book, the purpose is to read one, to read 10. It's my friend, Reb Gershon here in Metro Detroit, African-American convert to Judaism, Lanes has a blog, says that, he read 50 books last year. 1 week is probably average for an Ashkenazic Jew. So to read 1 book a week is average for an Ashkenazic Jew. Scholars, you probably read like 1 book a day. And, say like my house, you say I got everywhere, books, floor to ceiling. Every major rabbi, every time, you ever visit, a major rabbi, you will see books, floor to ceilings, every room in their house. And so like in Israel, in New York, in Detroit, it's basically a given. Every major rabbi, even, just a lay Jew, like David's not a rabbi, just like a person who takes my Judaism seriously. I have books floor to ceiling in every room in my house. And saying like, and that's common. And, so just start with something. I'd have to think about it. I don't know if there's any really good. I have a book on like the menorah, but like the meaning of it, like Hanukkah is a minor holiday. There's some books like Chabad about the mystical meaning. Maybe if I think about it. Yes, I don't think it's important to start, to start with. Like the point is that you start, and really you could start with any book. So biographies are very important. And, it's mentioning here, I mentioned like opened up along the precursor to the sages. So biographies of sages are a good way to inspire yourself. Like I said, okay, if you're non-Jewish, like all these books are written by Orthodox Jews for Orthodox Jews. So you might read them, get something out of it, but it might not, meet your flavor because, it said they're written by Orthodox Jews for Orthodox Jews. There's all sorts of books all over the place. So yeah, I'm not a book recommender type. Like if you were in my house and wanted to borrow a book or something like that, like I might just pick one out and be like, start with this one. But I mean, if you, like it said, like you want to know something about Judaism, you're not going to know it from one book. Like even like David, like I've read thousands of books, and he even said like, these are just books that I own. When I was in Israel, I read almost every book in the Or Samek library in Brooklyn. There was a few libraries, a few synagogues. I read, the English books, almost all of them. And, so just start with anything. And, from there you could jump in to reading more. So almost like the question defeats your purpose. So it's saying like, if you just want to know one book, you're not a serious student. From that, so to say, like one book's not going to do it. And Hanukkah is like just a minor holiday. I can't even think of a really good book on Hanukkah. And that's not generally the way Jewish books are written. Like if you think like a book on the holiday, like I can't even think like Pesach or Sukkah, you dive into the text, and over the next few weeks, I'll do other parts of my library, and hopefully that will be more insightful. But I thought I'd start with the biographies because, Judaism, we follow the sages. We don't follow the scripture. I mean, we follow the scripture and the books and the law, but we follow the sages. So I thought that the best way to introduce the Jewish section of my library would be through biographies. So Meir Zlotowitz, the father of Artscroll, a student of Moshe Feinstein, a student of the sages. Meir Zlotowitz did what the sages and the rabbis told them. You read his biography, every single important decision, he consulted Reb Moshe Feinstein, he consulted Rev Gifter, he did what they told him when it came to important decisions involving Judaism. I believe he was a typesetter. He started doing like typesetting for wedding invitations or something like that, and then started in Judaism. Started as a publisher. I think he translated the Megillah. The first Artscroll translation was of Megillah's Esther, which he did himself. And then as he became bigger, he started paying other rabbis to make translations and authoritative. And I think there's one story in there that they had one rabbi that he was working for, and the rabbi was like arguing with Rashi, and they got rid of him. He said like any rabbi that argues with Rashi is not cut out for Artscroll. He was saying like Rameir Zlotowitz was subservient to the sages. He believed in the sages, and anybody that wrote for Artscroll had that attitude of, so to say, the sages. So, no problem, Oswald. So, yeah, I can't recommend a book, because I don't even know where you're holding, and to say like, like the Tanya, like I mentioned the 4 books, like on the books that changed my life, I mentioned those few books. Like if I had to recommend a book, yeah, I would say Duties of the Heart, Tanya, Pirkei Avos, or The Path of the Tzaddikim. That those are the 4 most powerful books in Judaism, and they're more inspirational, esoteric. So check that video, the 13 books that changed my life, and the 4 Jewish books I mentioned there. So very important rabbi in terms of my study also. In terms of Detroit Judaism, Reb Shriger Feivel Mendelovich, who was one of the head rabbis, founders of Yeshiva Torah Vodaas, and also of Detroit Judaism, Yeshiva Beth Yehuda in Detroit. The rabbis that were sent to create Yeshiva Beth Yehuda in Detroit were sent by Reb Shriger Feivel Mendelovich, who sent 4 of his students, Goldstein and Friedman, and I forget the students, all the names, but they were in Torah Vodaas, and Rabbi Shriger Feivel Mendelovich sent them to Detroit in order to establish the Yeshiva Beth Yehuda here, now over 100 years ago. And Torah Vodaas was basically the first major yeshiva in America. In Williamsburg, it still exists. In Brooklyn today, I studied under Moshe Wolfson, who was the Mishkiach. He was called the Mishkiach. Moshe Wolfson was the Rav of Amunas Yisrael, but he was referred to as the Mishkiach, and he was the Mishkiach Rukni, which means like the spiritual advisor to students at Torah Vodaas, which we'll call like a Litvak Lithuanian yeshiva, but was Hasidic friendly. So a lot of Hasidic students learned there, but it has a Lithuanian, in the realm of the yeshiva world. The yeshiva system was largely created by a student of the Vilna Gaon, of Chaim Volozhin, and so the first yeshiva is really the Volozhin yeshiva, which leads to like Kelm and Mir and other the major yeshivas. So the yeshiva system is generally not called Litvish, like under the Vilna Gaon, as opposed to Hasidic. But Torah Vodaas was Hasidic friendly, and he called Rebbe. He didn't call himself a rabbi. He was somewhat like a rabbi. He was more like the principal. Did fundraising. So he was a rabbi. He was a sage, but he wasn't like the sages, like the other sages. He was more the administrator, principal, spirit behind Torah Vodaas. And Torah Vodaas is probably one of the most important milestones in American Jewish history. The yeshiva still exists in Flatbush, New York, and it said, I studied under Moshe Wolfson. Almost all of the, not all, but the major disciples of Rabbi Wolfson are rabbis in Torah Vodaas. And it said the Goldsteins. The Goldsteins from Detroit were very nice to me. They were in Israel. There was a Goldstein at in Israel, and they left Detroit. Saying that Goldstein came to Detroit, sent by Rabbi Shriger Feivel to help set up Yeshiva Beth Yehuda, and then eventually they went back to Brooklyn and Israel. But not just Detroit. A lot of Orthodox Jewry across America. One very important figure outside of Orthodox Jews. Even most modern Orthodox Jews probably never heard of Rav Shriger Feivel Mendelovich. Within the yeshiva system, very important name. Good book, Artscroll History. Okay, yeah, safe. Thanks for tuning in. So these are all Artscroll books. Here's another World War II book. This is a very interesting book. And I got a blessing from the current Belzer Rebbe when I was in Israel, and like Belz, I used to work together with Belz Yeshiva, like Naftali Matzter of Yafid. I remember, him in in the Munis Yisrael at Belz. But I knew hundreds of people in Belz Yeshiva. Used to come to a Munis Yisrael, and I went, to the major synagogue in Belz, one of the biggest Hasidic groups, member organizations of Agudas Yisrael. The Belzer Rebbe survives the war. Belz, before the war, was one of the bigger Hasidic groups. There were tens of thousands of Belzers before the war, and God forbid, a lot of the Belzers didn't survive the war, and the Nazis were superstitious about the Belzer Rebbe. So the Belzer Rebbe, the Nazis knew that the Belzer Rebbe was one of the most influential rabbis in the whole world, and when they captured the Belzer Rebbe, like it appeared he was captured, and then miraculously how he survived the war and was in the ghetto, and high-ranking Nazi officials used to visit the Belzer Rebbe in I forget if it was the Warsaw ghetto, and then eventually he makes his escape, and he's got his brother, and there's the reestablishment of the Belz Hasidus, and a younger rabbi. So I said, like, when I was in Israel in the late 90s, the Belzer Rebbe was maybe like in his 40s or 50s. But very interesting World War II story, the Belzer Rebbe, and it said like the leading Nazi officials used to visit the Belzer Rebbe and speak to him, and even refer to him as a miracle worker. That because the Belzer Rebbe was one of the most significant Rebbes in the time of World War II, and when they captured him, the Nazis were familiar with the reputation of the Belzer Rebbe, and even had some sort of awe that like this Rebbe is known as a miracle worker, and then eventually makes an escape and resettles in Israel. And said Belz is one of the most significant Hasiduses today. Here, Reb Matisyahu Solomon. I'm not sure if this is a biography or if it's like words of inspiration. I met Rabbi Solomon. I drove him, I think, even twice. Friendly man. I was driving a rabbi, and I remember he spoke to me when I first came to Brooklyn when I was like 19 years old. I was working for a rabbi who had an organization, and we drove Rabbi Solomon, and he spoke to me. He was like, "Oh, who's your driver?" And he asked me a few questions. He was nice to me, gave me a blessing. And he came to another event. I helped to Rav Chaim Cohn, who had Linus Tzedek, who I worked together with, help with his fundraising. He came to an event. But he's like Rabbi Wolfson. He's the Mishkiach in Lakewood, one of the more popular rabbis today. He said, Aaron Cutler, the founder, his sons, and Rev Matisyahu Solomon is the Mishkiach in Lakewood, one of the most well-known Orthodox rabbis in America today. Not a political rabbi, saying within the yeshiva system. It says has a educational role in Lakewood. This is a very interesting book, Rebbe, The House of Rizhin, Hasidus and the Rizhiner dynasty. So one of the major Hasidic dynasties, Rizhin, who is the father of a lot of the major groups today. I think even Karlin Stolen, the Rebbe, is descended from Rizhin. There's the Rizhiner Rebbe, the Biana Rebbe, and a few other like Kapishnitz and a few others that are descended from the house of Rizhin. The Rizhiner Rebbe, lived in opulence. Was possibly a renunciate also, but was very wealthy, and had was one of the major centers in Galicia, and is the father of many prominent Hasidic groups today, probably most notably Bian Sadigor in Israel, but Bian in America and Israel, Kapishnitz, Sadigor, and a lot of other Rebbes. I think even the Vishnitz and Karl and Stolen Rebbes, I believe, are also descended from the Regina Rebbe. And, so it's not just the biography of the first Regina Rebbe, but, his descendants and, the house today. Lauren, all these books are fine for women to read. So generally, women don't study Torah in the same way, like become rabbis. But even these books somewhat are written for women. So all these books, the biographies, are the type books that women would be encouraged to read, and it's just the level like studying Talmud. But I would even say that women are more likely to read these books than men. Like Duvid, like, okay, like I'm a half Jew, I'm an independent scholar, I'm not a rabbi, I like history, I like biography, I'm inspired by the rabbis, but I would actually guess that more women than men read these books, the biographies. The Tusher Rebbe, major Rebbe, survived the war in Montreal. So there's a settlement outside of Montreal called Kiryas Tush, which was founded by the Tusher Rebbe, who survived the war, was in Montreal, reestablished his Hasidic and education yeshiva school, and saw that it wasn't good for the students to be in the big city. And so he got some donors and got some land outside of Montreal called Tush and set up an establishment. And, I served the Sklener Rebbe. I was in Tush, actually. I got a blessing from the Tusher Rebbe. I drove the current Carlsberg Rebbe, Reb Moshe Roth, I think the father of Yol Roth, actually the Breslov, who became Breslov, but Rabbi Roth of blessed memory of Carlsberg passed away recently, and his son, his oldest son, who I believe is the Rebbe now there in Carlsberg, paid me money to drive him to a wedding in Tush, and the Tusher Rebbe came to the wedding, and it was also like a Sklen. So there was a lot of people from Tush. They're affiliated with Sklen. They both come from, I think, Romania. He was a known miracle worker, very big charity, helped a lot of people out. Prayed. A lot of people went for advice to Tush, blessings. It was like a pilgrimage site where people would travel to Tush and consult and get blessings from the Tusher Rebbe. Together with the Sklener Rebbe, one of the major Rebbes of last generation. A Torah scholar, like in the yeshiva world, like to compare like a Rosh Yeshiva, a lot of these Artscroll books are more, Litvish Rosh Yeshiva types, as opposed to the Hasidic Rebbes. So, known as a scholar, but I'm not sure if he wrote books, but more known as like a miracle worker and giving advice and set up, so you could go to Tush in Montreal till today. I think even mentioned to JF, some of like COVID-19, they were Tush was in the news. But outside of Montreal, this Jewish settlement still exists, Hasidic settlement. Very interesting book, Tusher Rebbe. Reb Dessler, The Life and Impact of Reb Eliyahu Eliezer Dessler, the Miktav Eliyahu. So very interesting books. I studied the Miktav Eliyahu. If you're still listening there, Oswald, the Miktav Eliyahu's books are very interesting, like philosophy, inspiration. I think he was the rabbi in Gateshead. So Reb Dessler studied in Kelm. Kelm is one of the major Lithuanian yeshivas. Like Mir, probably Kelm was more significant than Mir. I mean, Mir was a major yeshiva and became the biggest yeshiva in Jerusalem where I studied at. But in Europe, Kelm for a period of time was probably the most significant yeshiva where the best students studied at. And Reb Dessler ended up in Gateshead in England, and then eventually in Israel, and is an author of one of the best known rabbinic books, not commentary, but more philosophy books written in the last 100 years, the Miktav Eliyahu. Rav Yaakov, The Life and Times of a Gaon Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky. I think Rav Kamenetsky is a disciple of Slobodka. So he said there was Kelm and there was Slobodka, and you have like the altar of Slobodka was known as one of the biggest sages in all of Europe. And I think Rav Kamenetsky set up in Baltimore. I mean, he was all over. He was in after the war. He was in Toronto, and then he was at Tor Vodaas after meeting with Shaiger Feigo Mendelovich, who recruited him to Tor Vodaas. And no, so he stayed at Tor Vodaas. So it's a different one that was in Baltimore. He lived to 95 years old, and was considered one of the biggest rabbis in America of the previous generation. Rav Yaakov, a whole bunch of interesting stories. He was an educator who taught high school and post high school kids, but became one of the sages of the generation in America, mostly out of Tor Vodaas, and of the link between the destruction of European Jewry and American Jewry, where he was educated in Europe before the war, and then lived very old, to 95 years old, to spend decades in America reestablishing what was lost in Europe here in America. Rebbetzin Kanievsky, so he just passed away recently, was considered Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky. I think I also have his book. By far considered like the sage of the generation. Rav Chaim Kanievsky and his wife was also instrumental. And I think Rashimi Bertrand said, like, when an Orthodox Jew goes to Israel, he goes to the Kosel, to the Western Wall, and he goes to Bnei Brak to get a blessing from Rabbi Kanievsky. But his wife also met with women, gave blessings to women, helped her husband, and so Artscroll wrote a whole book about Rebbetzin Kanievsky. Interesting book. Rav Freifeld. So I mentioned in the Amunas Yisrael this kind of eccentric Satmar, former Satmar Chassid who went to Haight-Ashbury in the late 60s and was part of a Gurdjieff cult under Horn, and taught me about Gurdjieff. But he also studied in Shar Yoshev under Rav Shlomi Freifeld. And Shar Yoshev was like somewhat a Bali Tshuva yeshiva. I was in Shar Yoshev for a brief period of time. Rav Levi Burnham here in Metro Detroit was in Shar Yoshev, and Rav Freifeld was the Rosh Yeshiva there. And so here's sparks. There's more teachings in a biography of Rav Shlomi Freifeld, Shar Yoshev in Far Rockaway, which trained a lot of rabbis. The Five Towns, one of the wealthiest Jewish neighborhoods in the whole world, in Long Island. It was in Far Rockaway, but next to like the Five Towns, Lawrence and Cedarhurst. And I lived in Lawrence for a while, and we went to learn. And but he had already passed away before I got to New York. But he was the founder of Shar Yoshev, the first Rosh Yeshiva, Rosh Shlomi Freifeld, blessed memory. Reb Eliashiv passed away recently, lived over 100 years old, possibly considered, the Paisa Kador, the sage of the generation. He was, like the godfather of United Torah Judaism. He started in Europe as a child, was educated in Europe, moved to Israel after the war, and didn't have an official post. So he actually originally was part of the rabbinate, but then he became against the Israeli rabbinate due to early decisions like the Langer case and the question of who's a Jew, where he became don't call him anti-Zionist, but he was, originally tried to work with the state of Israel, and he thought the rabbinate, the state of Israel endorsed rabbinate was too lax on Jewish standards, and set out on his own, and had a small synagogue in Jerusalem, and humble man who basically just learned, but he was the Paisik Ador, not as much as Reb Kanievsky, where it was like a tourist attraction. Like every, like thousands of Jews every day went to get a blessing to Rabbi Kanievsky. And I think Reb Kanievsky was actually his son-in-law. So I mean, they're like related, and he lived like over 100. So he was related to Reb Kanievsky. He had a lot of children, lived very humble life, and just studied Torah, and was the most consulted rabbi on Jewish law, the most authoritative rabbi in Jewish law of the last generation. Now he's passed away, maybe like at Reb Edelstein in Panovich, and possibly of the more revival of Sephardic Judaism. So for a period of time, like I mentioned, the first books in their shadows, where Ashkenazic rabbis dominated Torah in Israel, where you had, now you might have a little bit of, with the passing away, very few to almost none of the rabbis. I don't think there's any rabbi who became a rabbi before the war still alive. So like Reb Eliashiv, Reb Kanievsky, those were people who became rabbis in Europe. Aaron Cutler, Reb Moshe, they were already respected rabbis in Europe before the war, and then reestablished the Torah in New York and in Israel, and that doesn't really exist anymore. You have a few rabbis that were born in Europe before the war, but none that were rabbis before the war. So now, like who are the Gedolim? As before, all of the major Gedolim were rabbis who trained in these major yeshivas, Kelm, Slobodka, Mir, in Europe, and so the new generation of sages, were not trained in Europe, and some of them are the kids and sons-in-laws of them, so it's some of them more Sephardi. So let me put these back on my shelf. I'll keep on going. I have a few more art scrolls. Okay, so I said Reb Moshe Feinstein. This one, a big one. So I said Reb Moshe Feinstein with Aaron Cutler are probably the two most important Orthodox rabbis in America. Both became rabbis in Europe, and Reb Moshe Feinstein was the Rosh Yeshiva of MTJ, Mesivta Tiferes Yerushalayim, in the Lower East Side, somewhat a minor yeshiva. I actually lived in the Lower East Side. I prayed there a few times. Aaron Cutler, became the head of the major yeshiva in Lakewood. But Reb Moshe was known as, the Paisik. He was a ruler on Jewish law, and he ruled on everything. And all sorts of people wrote him, and he wrote back in his collected letters. And his rulings are still till today the most definitive rulings in American Jewry on all sorts of questions, from kosher to abortion to marijuana. Moshe was the go-to. His son, Rav David Feinstein, who also recently passed away, was possibly still the major American Paisik Ador, judge, ruler on Jewish law of the generation. So, and also, Rav Moshe was a sage. Like I mentioned, Rav Meir Zlotowitz, a lot of Orthodox Jews, they went to Rav Moshe and they did what he told them. Like he was I would say a small man. I mean, literally, he was a small man. He was great in learning. His yeshiva wasn't that big, during his lifetime. Like I think Friday he gave a Chumash class to not that many people. but he was respected, and among Orthodox Jews all over the place, they went to Rav Moshe, they asked him the questions, and then they did what he said. And sort of Meir Zlotowitz, and a lot of major stories, some miracle stories, charity stories, mostly known for Jewish law. And it said probably the single most important American Orthodox rabbi. But Aaron Cutler is probably number two. But saying that Aaron Cutler founded Lakewood, the biggest yeshiva, and he was part of the War Refugee Board. But Rav Moshe is like the father of American Jewish law. So Rav Elia Lopian, who wrote, I think he wrote popular books, and he also started in Europe, and let me check the name of the book, but I forget. I think he studied in Kelm and made his way to Israel and yeshiva there, and he was like a modern day father of the Musar movement. I think I actually met his son. That there's a Karlin Stolner Chassid named Stefanski that I think was married within his family, and so he studied in Kelm Yeshiva, which possibly was the most well-known and respected yeshiva in Europe for producing Torah scholars, especially within the Musar school, and kept the Musar school going in Israel. Reb Mordechai Gifter. I believe I also met him. I think he came to Detroit. I think he was at Gary Torgau's house. Passed away recently of, I think he's in Indiana. So he was also one of the fathers of Artscroll. And I think he actually came from like a modern background, kind of like somewhat like a Baal Tshuva when he was very young. And then he ends up he was born in Virginia, and he becomes the Rosh Hashiva of Telz in Cleveland, and one of the biggest rabbis in America outside of New York. Say humble beginnings, took his learning seriously. An American created Gadol. So he was born in America, educated in America, headed a yeshiva in America. I think he actually came to Detroit twice. I think I saw him twice, both at Gary Torgau's house when he came to speak there. I went to listen to him, passed away recently, was on the advisory committee for the creation of Artscroll, and say like an American trained Gadol, and he headed Telz Yeshiva for decades. And, so he became, so he was in Cleveland at the Telz Yeshiva and, headed the yeshiva, but was renowned, Israel worldwide, but across America as an authority. After Rav Moshe passed away, people would seek him for counsel and for specific questions about Jewish law in America. Rav Mordechai Gifter, blessed memory. Here, Great Five Lives, the Stipler, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, Rav Moshe Feinstein, Rav Yehuda Leib Segel, and Rav Zalman Auerbach. Artscroll book. There's 5 major rabbis. I'll save this one for last. I studied under this rabbi, blessed memory, Mir Yeshiva. Journey Through Jerusalem. This is an interesting book. The historic visit of the Munkacher, Reb Minchas Eliezer Munkach, and the Saba Kadisha. So this is, I think, before World War I. And the Munkacher Rebbe in Munkach, one of the larger Hasidus in Brooklyn. Today you have the Munkacher Rebbe that went to the mikveh. I got a blessing from the Munkacher Rebbe. And it comes from a long tradition of sages. And so this is specifically the Minchas Eliezer, I think maybe the founder of the Munkach dynasty. And he went to Israel and met with a Sephardic sage who they called the Saba Kadisha, who, most of the Torah was in Europe. There wasn't that great Torah settled. So there was a Sephardic sage who was believed to be like over 100 years old, the Saba Kadisha in Jerusalem, and he actually bequeathed his library to Mumkach. So interesting book, Minchas Eliezer in the history and his visit to Israel, and he actually established a synagogue in Jerusalem in that visit. And Mumkach is known to be anti-Zionist, still today, somewhat anti-Zionist, although the Mumkach Rebbe was one of the first Rebbes to establish a synagogue in Jerusalem and met with one of the leading sages of Jerusalem, the Saba Kadisha, who bequeathed his large library collection to him. Reb Pinchas Scheinberg of Torah Or in Har-Nof in Jerusalem. I also met this rabbi, got a blessing. The rabbi wore a whole bunch of pairs of tzitzis, founded Torah Or Yeshiva. An interesting rabbi. And Reb Nosson Tzvi Finkel. So when I went into Mir Yeshiva, he was the Rosh Yeshiva. I actually was in his class, in his house. God forbid he suffered Parkinson's. And, so he wasn't considered the highest class, but he was still the Rosh Yeshiva. He was descendant from the Finkels, the former Rosh Yeshivas before the war. He was born in America and somewhat brought up modern Orthodox. In his early 20s, moved to Israel. And they say he spent like 10 years without going outside the building. All he did was study Torah, rose to become Rosh Yeshiva. And so when I applied to get into the yeshiva, I had to speak to the Rosh Yeshiva, and he invited me to be part of his class. I went to his class when they studied Gemara in the Dorim. But he said because he had Parkinson's, he spoke slowly, so it wasn't that popular of a class. It wasn't considered like, Rav Usher, the higher level classes. But I learned a lot. Great man, generous man, kind man. Was nice to me personally. Allowed me into his yeshiva, and Nosson Tzvi Finkel. So I got more. So those are just my Artscroll books. Okay, so these are, I'll call modern Orthodox books. Well, yeah, High T talking about studying Talmud is considered studying Torah. So in yeshiva, like we study Talmud, but it's called studying Torah. We don't say like we're going to study Talmud. We say we're going to study Torah. Torah is, it said that at the beginning, we follow the sages of the generation. And so the words of the sages of the generation are considered Torah. So it's purposeful in the statements that, the words of the current sages, the words of the Talmud are considered Torah. So, like if you're like a Karaite, you only believe in the words of the prophet, saying generally Orthodox Judaism, all forms of Judaism, we follow the words of the sages of the generation. And if you're studying the books of one of the current sages, that's considering studied Torah. That's the expression used and has that meaning. So here's a few we'll call modern Orthodox rabbis that I'm not sure if you call them sages. So here, Mark Shapiro, Luke Ford's buddy, Jewish studies. I watch his thing on Torah in Motion, usually in 2-speed. So he wrote a book on the life and works of Rav Kiel Yaakov Weinberg, who went to Orthodox yeshivas and then became kind of like the father of modern Orthodoxy between both worlds. So, generally the modern Orthodox rabbis aren't really considered sages, but they're within, like the wider blanket network. And, so Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg came to America, had classical Orthodox training, but then became more modern Orthodox. Here, my local Young Israel rabbi's great-grandfather, Rabbi Silver, was studied, I think, under the Alter of Slobodka, the Chaim Moser Grudzinski, came to America, was kind of like just an Orthodox shul rabbi, but headed up the network to become like the chief rabbi of America and Canada. Whenever Aaron Cutler came over, he basically took charge. So he's more famous among modern Orthodox Jews to say, whether he falls in the realm of Orthodoxy or modern Orthodoxy. He was integral in helping during the war, trying to reestablish and save Orthodox rabbis. So he's more renowned. In fact, among most Orthodox Jews, never even heard of him. He's not in the pantheon. In Yeshiva University, they try to put him into the pantheon. And he also, it kind of was like he used to sue conservative and reform rabbis, like for name and for like kosher and various things. But it was one of the heads of the first institutes of, what we'll call Orthodox rabbis before the mainstream Orthodox rabbis came over and then took over the Orthodox rabbis. I think he was also involved in the book burning of Aryeh Kaplan, where they burnt Rev Aryeh Kaplan's translation of like the prayer book. And so it was his gathering where they burnt his book outside. It's unclear whether he was involved in the book burning of Aryeh Kaplan. But so some of the modern Orthodox, he's from one of the sages. And, a lot of Orthodox books will include him. He helped Rav Aaron Cutler and set up. And basically, Rav Moshe, the organization that Rav Moshe Feinstein eventually took over was headed by Rav Eliezer Silver. But, say he was a rabbi, he was trained in Slobodka under respected the Orthodox rabbis, but wasn't really from the sages. But the modern Orthodox world is within so to say the pantheon. So this is it's this OU Press. So he's saying the Orthodox Union published their own book. So there's no Artscroll book on Rabbi Silver, but the Orthodox Union published, but an important rabbi in American history, certain one of the more pivotal, like the March on Washington during the war, setting up the organizations, the fight against reform and orthodoxy for the heart of reform and conservative Judaism for the heart of kashrus and various things, and helping Orthodox Jewish rabbis settle in America, work with the army, various things. So important rabbi Rav Eliezer Silver, written by Rav Aaron Rakefet Rotkov, anyway, like yu.org. He's got the most classes. He's like the father of American Jewish history. Rav Aaron Rakefet Rotkov, he's now in Jerusalem, but he taught a class on Jewish history at Yeshiva University. I think he's the rabbi of Rav Evan Hoffman, buddies, cousins of half Galician, who's the father of American Jewish history. Also, Rafal Medov at the Wyman Center of Holocaust Studies. He's written some books, Holocaust scholar, but here's his biography of Rav Chesed, the life and times of Rav Chasko Luchstein, who was the rabbi who converted Ivanka Trump. Rabbi Luchstein, the rabbi of Bnei Yeshurun on the Upper West Side, for generations, the head of the school, the name slipping me, on the Upper East Side, where Kushner sent his kids to. Modern Orthodox sage, but you say he's not modern Orthodox. He's not considered in the pantheon of the sages, within the school of modern Orthodoxy, but important rabbi. He was there in the Trump administration. He spoke at some of the major events, and was integrally involved with Donald Trump and Ivanka Trump's conversion. And another book. This is really more just American Orthodoxy Awakens, the Belkin era of Yeshiva University. So Belkin's not even a rabbi, but he's more the principal founder of Yeshiva University. So it's more just history of Yeshiva University. So put a handful of modern Orthodox books. Okay, so these are Hasidic books of various publishers. So most of these books are Hasidic or different publishers. Then I'm going to do my Lubavitch ones. And I got some on my desk, like generic history books. And so the Heschel tradition, the Apter Rebbe, the life and teachings of Rav Arvin Yeshua Heschel of Apt. And I think he's part of maybe the Regina dynasty also. The Apter Rebbe is a famous Rebbe. This is more Torah based on the Parsha, but this is going back in Europe, 1755 to 1825. The Apter Ruv. Here's the Rogachover Gaon, who was like the rabbi to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He was a teacher to the Lubavitcher Rebbe when he was young. Was not a Rebbe, but involved with Chabad. Is respected across Europe as a big Gaon and scholar, and he was integral in the education of the Lubavitch Rebbe in his youth. I have a few of Chaim Delphin. I mentioned in my 13 books that changed my life. When I first came to Borough Park, I worked for Rav Chaim Delphin, Rav Avram Yaakov Braun, who helped me get started in Borough Park, was studying Tanya, that I mentioned under Tanya, because he gave me a Tanya, and he was studying with Rav Chaim Delphin and introduced me to Rav Chaim Delphin, who gave me some work, and I even slept in he had an apartment synagogue in Flatbush for a while. And so he wrote a biography of the real Shlomo, Rav Shlomo Carlebach, and covers Rav Shlomo Carlebach is not considered a sage to Orthodox rabbis. He did a lot of good. He studied under the Lubavitch Rebbe. He was one of the three main non-Lubavitch disciples of the Lubavitch Rebbe: Rav Moshe Wolfson, Rav Shlomo Carlebach, and Reb Ben-Zion Shenker, the Mudjitzer singer, were three students under the Lubavitch Rebbe before the Lubavitcher Rebbe became Rebbe. Shlomo Carlebach, did things out of the bounds of orthodoxy, but accomplished a lot. So, interesting biography. So I wouldn't include, Reb Shlomo's not within the pantheon, but he's probably one of the most famous American rabbis. His songs are sung all over the place. He was a scholar. He knew Rav Aaron Cutler. He was within the system. He still has the Carlebach Synagogue. He had a twin brother who was a Lubavitcher Chassid. There's the Carlebach Synagogue on the Upper West Side. So Rav Shlomo Carlebach, I have another book I'll show in a minute, Rav Shlomo. Here's another Rabbi Delphin, Chabad Portraits, random biographical events of Chabad personalities. I have quite a few Rav Chaim Delphin books, and I even typeset for him. I worked for him, helped typesetting, and worked on some of his books. I mostly did driving for him in various random tasks, but I also did some computer work for Rabbi Delphin. Here, Reb Menachem Mendel of Rimanov, 1745 to 1815, one of the early Hasidic masters. I think was his Talmud of the Maggid of Mizrich. His descendant, the current day Rimanover Rebbe, comes to Detroit. Used to. I'm not sure if he's been in the last few years. I have the current Rimanover Rebbe on my YouTube page when he came to Detroit for Log B'Omer. I have singing songs in Nagunim with the Rimanover Rebbe. So he's a direct descendant who had dealings with Napoleon. That the Rimanover Rebbe met with Napoleon. So he was one of the major Hasidic Rebbes in Europe. And today there's still Rimanov, just kind of like a small synagogue, not a big movement. But Menachem Mendel, the first Rimanover Rebbe, was one of the integral founders of the Hasidic movement. So this has, biography and then Torah divided up by the weekly portion. Here's a Mir Yeshiva in Brooklyn. I studied in Mir in Jerusalem. I think Judas Maccabeus went to Mir in Brooklyn. Visions of the Rev Avram Kalmanovich, who was in Europe, came over to America with Rev Cutler, and Rev Eliezer Silver was on the refugee board, helping European Jewry resettle in America, and became the Rosh Yeshiva of Mir Yeshiva in Brooklyn. There's Rebbe Nachman until Mashiach, the life of Rebbe Nachman, translated by Aryeh Kaplan. So, Rebbe Nachman, very important. It could be my ancestors in the Ukraine were followers of Rebbe Nachman. So, until the Mashiach, Aryeh Kaplan, translation of the biography of Rebbe Nachman, a lot of interesting stuff. Rebbe Nachman goes to Israel. His meetings with the Lubavitch Rebbe. Rebbe Nachman was the great grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, was excommunicated twice. I think Chaim Volozhiner, excommunicated him also. So a lot of interesting, important biographical pieces of information. I think this is a kid's book. Rashi, the story of Rav Shlomo Yitzchaki. So it said biographies didn't really exist in the till really like 200 years ago. I mean, the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, the founding of America, but I'm not sure that what would be considered like the first biography in larger, even academic level. So these are kind of like based on legends or teaching. I mentioned the Rabbi Wolfson story at the beginning, but based off what we know, and it's kind of written for kids that has kind of like legends. Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, ironically, related relatively closely to the Emanuels, Rahm Emanuel and Ari Emanuel. Their like grandfather was in the Irgun, but I think was Auerbach. For the exact relation, you could look that up on Wikipedia. Where Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was one of the major sages of Jerusalem and Israel, and also trained in Europe and helped reestablish yeshiva system in Israel. Here's Reb Lazer. Reb Lazer Geldzaler passed away young. I think I met him, Reb Lazer. So he set up a yeshiva for like troubled Hasidim and became very popular and among Hasidim. And then he passed away young. And here's Rabbi Meshul Feibush Heller. This is just a generic book on the rise of Hasidim in Galicia. So I'll show a few other books that I have. Here's the last of my biographies. Holy Warrior, Rev Avram Abba Friedman of Detroit. So Rabbi Friedman was one of the rabbis, I believe, that was sent by Schweiger Feigl Mendelovich to help set up Yeshiva Beth Yehuda in Detroit. His son here, I think the video I have of Hanukkah chanting is at his house. He has regular gatherings. His son, Republican leaning, actually. I saw him when it was in Israel. When I was in Israel, he had already retired and spent his last few of years life in Israel and used to go to Spiemeier Zilberberg. So I met him by Spiemeier Zilberberg. And this was written by Gary Torgau, a banker, prominent Jew in Metro Detroit, who's actually on the board of Artscroll. So ironic that this is not an Artscroll book. It was written before he became on the board of director of Artscroll. But the Holy Warrior, Rav Avram Abba Friedman, a very important rabbi in Metro Detroit. written by Gary Torgow. So put these back on the shelf. Okay, I actually still got quite a few more to do. So I like biographies. For years, I read these books kind of like before I fell asleep. That I would read these books before I fell asleep. I would read. Some of these books I'll cover again. So let me do my Chabad books on the Chabad rabbi. So for years, I would read biographies of the sages in my bed before I fell asleep, because just interesting stuff. And I still largely read biographies before I go to sleep, but very interesting stuff. I love biographies. As in somewhat more like these books are maybe somewhat more written for women. Within Orthodox Judaism, the kind of like history biography isn't part of general Orthodox Judaism, like Artscroll or whatever. But I love biographies, so I have a whole bunch of them. You see like 2 full shelves and more. So here are my books on the Lubavitch Rebbe. This is interesting. Another Rabbi Delphin book, Rav and the Rebbe. That this Rev Soloveitchik and the Rebbe who knew each other. They knew each other in Europe and in America, and their paths crossed multiple times. And another Rabbi Delphin book, interesting book. Here's the famous Telushkin book, the Rebbe, who he came to Detroit. I got a picture with him. He spoke at the, this was not on this book, but his other book, he came to the JCC, and I got a selfie with him. Reb Telushkin's famous Rebbe book, and his father was the accountant for the Rebbe, and Telushkin's kind of more modern Orthodox, but he was also, I guess, a Lubavitcher Chassid, and he's a popular author, and his father was the accountant for the Rebbe and had personal dealings with the Rebbe, and this is kind of considered like the definitive biography of the Rebbe. Here was a biography written by a Lubavitcher, Rav Chaim Miller, Turning Judaism Outward. So this is more, like a kosher Lubavitch biography of the Rebbe. Telushkin tries to be more academic from Orthodox perspective. Here's another one. My Story, 41 individuals share their personal encounters with the Rebbe. So there's all types of books like these, and like I'll probably do a separate stream on just my books about Lubavitch. But so there's just 41 people sharing their encounters with the Rebbe, and Lubavitch produced this a few years ago. There might be more now. I haven't checked. The early years, formative years of the Rebbe, Reb Menachem Mendel Shtirson, as told by documents and archival data, where you actually have like pictures, legal documents of the early life of the Rebbe and what could be garnered from the Rebbe's personal collection, legal documents, things could be found. And this book is officially published by Kitav, the Lubavitcher Publishing Society. It's not really like a biography, but it's more documentary, and this be like the legends of rabbis from a Lubavitcher perspective. It has a lot of pictures and documents and maps of where the Lubavitcher Rebbe lived, and the Chabad in the various times, and the documents that they could find. So I have more. So Here's another Reb Shlomo, The Life and World of Reb Shlomo Carlebach by Brandwein. This is actually translated from Hebrew into English. And so it's kind of like a very pro Carlebach, legend stories biography. This one's more academic. So as I mentioned, like before a few hundred years ago, we don't really have any biographies. So this is the Arizal, physician of the soul, healer of the cosmos, Isaac Lurie and his Kabbalistic fellowship. So this actually covers some more Kabbalistic ideas. I might cover this again later. But has some basic biographical information of the Arizal and his major students, but more focuses on Kabbalah. Here is Benjamin Lau, the son of the Rabbi Lau, the former chief rabbi of Israel, the rabbi of the synagogue in the Old City, and he wrote a 4-volume series of the sages. So the sages, character, context, and creativity. 4 volumes, the Second Temple period from Yavna to the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Galilean period, and from the Mishnah to the Talmud. So it's more biographical information about the rabbis in the Talmud. And so there's not too many books like that. Like you might find a book in like Hillel, Rebbe Akiva, but we don't have biographies. We have some legends and stories. So Rabbi Lau pieces together the lives and kind of like biographical of the sages. So this is interesting. Like people like history, you could look, Rabbi Lau's The Sages, you could read them as is. They're interesting, but they might be more related to Talmud study. And it's like within the Orthodox world, Rabbi Lau is chief rabbi, more modern Orthodox. That would include history. So like in the Orthodox world, maybe a handful of people would look at these because they're like biography is not really a yeshiva subject. Even history is not really a yeshiva subject. But this is I recommend these. I like these. The Rabbi Lau's The Sages. I have them somewhere else in my library, so I wouldn't really include those with figure out how to for next week. I'm gonna have to reorganize my library a little bit more, but I'll put that more with my Talmudic books. So I'm wrapping up here. So if anyone has any questions, they could @Duvid. This is my last stack here. So here's random Rabbi Sherwin Wein, A Life of Courage. So he was the founder of Humanistic Judaism. He was a rabbi at Temple Bethel in Metro Detroit and founded Humanistic Judaism. So, it wouldn't be included the Orthodox sages at all, but, in Metro Detroit, interesting rabbi. I think Joseph Cato is a follower of Rabbi Wein. Humanistic Judaism was actually, I think he's considered the founder here in Metro Detroit, and he was at Temple Bethel where, in like the 60s where I had my bar mitzvah and then went to found and create Humanistic Judaism. I think passed away. I'm not sure what year. Here, Rabbi Emil Hirsch was a conservative rabbi, the Jewish preacher, compiled, I think, by his son. So like, I think he was in Chicago, prominent conservative rabbi in Chicago, collected biography and thoughts. And this is also an important book. I'll go over this again later. Menashe ben Israel's Mission to Oliver Cromwell, a reprint of the pamphlet published by Menashe ben Israel to promote the readmission of Jews to England. So Menashe ben Israel, very important figure who convinced Cromwell to let the Jews back in. And this is a reprint of his letter to Cromwell. I think it has some biographical information in it also. Here, like no Orthodox rabbi would do this. Never seen such a thing. But, probably one of the most significant rabbis in America, Stephen Weiss, the autobiography, Challenging Years, dealing with Roosevelt and various things. So this is autobiography of Stephen Weiss, the Weiss synagogues, who was the advisor to Franklin Roosevelt during World War II, and who wrote an autobiography. And he's definitely the most prominent figure in rabbinic American Judaism during World War II, conservative rabbi. Here's an Israeli academic book, the Untold Tales of Hasidim, Crisis and Discontent in the History of Hasidim, David Asaf, that, kind of like the real history, like the academic, the darker stuff that the Orthodox rabbis won't tell you. Saying the rabbis are just human, and there's some stuff that they sweep under the rug, and so this is an Israeli academic book. Rabbi Heilman, not Heilman, Samuel Hyman, probably the most popular writer of Jewish culture in modern America, Who Will Lead Us, that talks about modern day rabbis and gives a little bit of their history. I think he's a professor of sociology or something like that. So, Mumkat, Beyond, Baba, Satmar, and Chabad. So this was a popular book. It said, the other books are Orthodox Jews, written for Orthodox Jews. This is like within Jewish studies, but he had access to some of the rabbis. Here's Henry Abramson's book on the Eish Kodesh, Reb Kalman Columnus Shapira, who I mentioned his books as Student Obligations, one of the books that changed my life. So he wrote a biographical compendium of what was going on during the war to his Eish Kodesh, the sermons. This is an interesting book. I didn't have this with my Holocaust section. Very intense book, Rabbi Victor Miller. I thought I owned, they have an Artscroll one on Rabbi Miller. Maybe I didn't own it, but I've definitely read it. And I'm pretty sure I owned the Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch Artscroll biography, although I couldn't find it. But I definitely remember reading it. I'm pretty sure I used to own it. Also, I have his collective writings. I'll go over that at a different time. But, this one, Holocaust books, maybe should have included, which Rabbi Victor Miller wrote this and never published it, and then his sons published it. And it was his thoughts on the Holocaust, and very intense and, not very politically correct. And, his thoughts and very, very strong words against reform and secular Judaism, Mendelssohn, and the decline of Torah, and his understanding of, God forbid, the Holocaust being divine punishment from God. God forbid, not caused by anti-Semitism, but it was divine ordained punishment from God. Rabbi Victor Miller. I met Rabbi Victor Miller before he passed away. I was at his funeral. I remember when he passed away, I went to his funeral. It was huge in Brooklyn. Tens of thousands of people. I prayed in his synagogue once, Mincha Marav. Here, Sri Rabinovitz and Harry Rabinowitz, Hasidism in Israel, a history of the Hasidic movements and its masters in the Holy Land, and Hasidism, the movements and its masters. So just brief histories of many of the various Hasidic groups. I had some other books like the history, like the Akronim, the Rishonim, and Hasidim that have very short histories, but biographical. And then this, I actually went to University of Michigan. He spoke. Interesting book. It was kind of expensive. Marcin Wodzinski, The Historical Atlas of Hasidim. And, so this isn't about like Rebbes, but it's more demographic study about maps and demographics of Hasidim, where and when we were in different places in Europe when we got there, how the populations rose and fell, and mostly maps. So this, to put together, trying to understand the history of Hasidim, this is a very good book and has a whole bunch of maps. You can look on YouTube. The book's kind of expensive, but he has presentations on YouTube that include him going over maps. just, understand also, like, God forbid, like, like the Holocaust, and to understand, like, there were thousands of Jewish towns. Some of them had tens of thousands of Hasidim living in them across Europe, and just to understand that history of how that came to be, how the population of Orthodox Jews in Eastern Europe got so large, where the centers were, and then to see after the war that basically none of these existed. How could there have been 10 million Jews in Eastern Europe before World War II to just hundreds of thousands left after the war, with God forbid the millions that died, and the ones that survived to make it to Europe and America. But just to understand through map and representation of Jews first moving into Eastern Europe and the expansions of the towns and territories. Okay, so that will be part one. So next week too, I hope to continue with my tour of my library, the Jewish section. I'm not sure. Maybe I'll try to do more like Torah yeshiva books, like texts that are studied, famous rabbinic books. And then I have like a generic history section. I have a whole shelf of like, Jews of India, Jews of the South, like Jews of Detroit, Jews of Michigan. So I'll have to organize my books a little bit. I have a lot of books on Israel, like just history books on Israel, history books on global Judaism, history books on Jews in the U.S. Then I have like cultural books about the effects of Jews on culture. They have books like Jews in medicine, Jews in science. I have like a shelf of counter-Semitic books, and then I probably have a full like complete shelf, 5 or 6 shelves of Torah books of like tight texts that are studied in yeshiva. So I'll have to see what I'm going to do next week. So if there's any questions in the chat, you could do a quick @Duvid. Thanks, Jim, for showing up, and hi T for being active in the chat. So yeah, Jim, if you meet up and stream with Luke, check that out. So see what's going on with Luke. Me and Luke did quite a few streams on Jewish studies. Like talking about Mark Shapiro. We read that book from Nussbaum. I forget the conservative rabbi who wrote all those books in like the creation of Jewish academic studies and like the theory of Jewish history. So even the concept of what does biography mean, like as I mentioned, like the precursors of what does it mean Jews written for Jews, if you're an Orthodox Jew, a Jewish student, a rabbinic student, versus Jewish books written for non-Jews, even though probably most of the people who read them are Jews, but kind of written generically, as opposed to books written for people that the assumptions that they're Orthodox Jews that are following the law, believes in the sages, to academic books, to all different type books versus actual textbooks, like what we consider authoritative texts that Jews study, that are kind of believe that God is behind the words, like high T, like Torah, saying like in yeshiva we don't study Talmud, we study Torah because the Talmud is considered Torah. There's a distinction between Talmud and like like the Rambam says you should like halacha and various things that's considered studying Torah. There's not like the differentiation like, oh, this is the scripture, this is the prophecy, and these are the words of the rabbis, because that's the Orthodox system. We don't follow the scripture, we follow the sages of the generation. And so that's an important connotation of what it means to be an Orthodox Jew. So yeah, I mean the obviously the majority of Jews are not Orthodox. Like in Israel, Orthodox Judaism's increasing, they're increasing, but like in America, at most 20% would be Orthodox, and it's close to 10%. In Israel, it might be like 25%. But Orthodox Judaism is well defined, as opposed to other forms of Judaism are not well defined. You could even define it as an ethnic group, or in Orthodox Judaism has clear leadership. Like there's clear, recognizable sages, as opposed to like the ADL or leaders of Jewish organizations are not really considered leaders of the Jews. They might lead Jewish organizations or even politicians, Israeli politicians. And the tradition means saying the Orthodox sages claim in theory within the Orthodox Judaism to be the direct disciples of Moses, that there's an unbroken tradition going back from Moses, from the patriarchs to the rabbis today. And Jewish organizations don't claim that. And, I mean, there are Karaites, they still exist. But it's saying really Orthodox Judaism is the only one that, the sages that have some sort of claim on having sages of the generation. So, like I gave Dishon my book on Ovadia Yosef, and like, God forbid, there was a vote in Egypt. Ovadia Yosef, I think he was born in Iraq, and then he was in Israel, and then they sent him to be chief rabbi of Egypt. And he was trying to make the Egyptian Jews Orthodox, like keep kosher and follow the law. And they had a vote of the Jewish Society of Egypt of whether to keep Ovadia Yosef as rabbi. And they voted, God forbid, it was like 90% to fire him. That the Jews of Egypt voted to fire Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, and like 9 out of 10 of them voted to get rid of him because they didn't want some rabbi telling them what to do. They didn't, they wanted to do what they wanted to do, and they didn't consider that they should have some Orthodox rabbi in charge of them. And so in America, Orthodox Jews are voluntary. There might be societal pressures, like marriage or shunning or various things, but Orthodox Jewry in America is a voluntary association. In Israel, there's some legalities, like in terms of military service, tax status, but even in Israel, Orthodoxy is largely voluntary. So the sages are voluntarily held up. Orthodox Jews voluntarily follow the sages. So if you want to convert, and you're saying by law, Israel only recognizes the Orthodox rabbis, and you say that's involuntary, but you're saying that people follow the sages voluntarily. So if you prescribe to the religious belief system that the system is true, and the sages to some extent are divinely inspired to speak for God. So if you don't believe in the system, you might be a secular Jew who respects the rabbis, but you can actually believe that they have some like bearing to divinely speak for God. So I spent my first 10 years of Judaism where I basically did what the rabbis told me. I followed the Orthodox rabbis. I accepted even that the Orthodox rabbis were kind of like vehicles of God's message on earth. And obviously most Jews don't believe that. Most Jews don't follow them. I'll talk more. I'll show more books on generic Judaism. And I've talked, like Kevin McDonald, and I put that as the 13 books that changed my life, and the concept of Judaism as a group strategy. So we say, well, what is the group strategy of Jews if it's not the religion? So there's elements within the group strategy that are derived from the religion. There's elements of the group strategy. Well, the group strategy is what the sages say. But it's like, no, I mean, the group strategy is more indicative of the masses of secular Jewish organizations, but there's still some sort of decipherable group strategy to all Jews. And even think Kanye West, when from the Kabbalistic, I'll also, hopefully do a stream on my Kabbalah books. But, like Kanye West, God forbid, Gavin McGinnis, said like, well, you want to differentiate. Well, like you shouldn't judge all Jews by, or I guess his Jews in name only. And, as opposed to like all Jews, and Kanye was like, nope, all Jews. So from the Kabbalistic point, no, it's all Jews. All Jews follow some sort of group strategy based on a soul type, whether they're Orthodox or believe it or not. So if you're Jewish, you're under this group strategy, kind of like the control of God, this divine mission, repair the world, whether you know it or not, whether you want it or not. And so it's interesting that, Kanye West was like, Jews in name only. He's like, nope, I judge them all together. And generally that's the way the sages look at it also. Like the Maggid of Mizrich said to the Baal Shem Tov, like to his disciples, you have to love an evil Jew just like you love a good Jew. The Lubavitch Rebbe, was the prince, the Messiah, for all Jews, whether they recognized him or not, whether they wanted to be or not. That so it's interesting. What is Jewish identity? What role do the sages play in Jewish identity, especially like in Israel, where the sages are not very respected? Even like Judas Maccabeus was openly blasting the sages. Like he's supposedly an Orthodox Jew, and he was openly besmirching the sages. Luke Ford, Orthodox convert, to some extent openly besmirches the sages. So like the Jews that live under the sages, respect the sages, are probably less than 10% of world Jewry. But like generally, like the theory, like I certainly believe in the theory of the sages of the generation, the Jewish law and what the books say. And, so it's very complicated to understand what does Judaism mean or Jewish sectarianism. And, then you have like Jew versus Jew, where, how could you have some sort of generic Judaism when Jews disagree with each other about so much, and like the two Jews, three opinions, or there's certain things that are agreed more or less than other Jews. So like the importance of the Holocaust, if you just look at polling and like various things like the Israel, Jewish food, culture, humor that are common among the masses of Jews. Nothing's like 100%, but some things are close to 90%. So it's a little bit interesting, and hopefully we'll talk about that more. So I'm going to sign off. Thanks for tuning in. God bless. Shalom, and look forward next week, 4 p.m. So more on Judaism. So the next few weeks I'll be talking about Judaism. So have a great night, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.